That's not art. That's desperation. The words cut through the pristine silence of the private gallery like breaking glass. Regina clutched her worn portfolio closer to her chest, feeling the sting of laughter rippling through the crowd of champagne-sipping elites. The curator's voice dripped with practiced disdain as he continued his assault on her life's work. In her simple black dress from a department store sale rack, she stood surrounded by designer labels and generations of inherited wealth. She hadn't expected kindness, but she hadn't prepared for this level of cruelty either. The exclusive preview event at Hartley's Gallery was supposed to be her chance, one shot at breaking into the world that controlled the fate of emerging artists. Crystal chandeliers cast judgmental light across marble floors, illuminating priceless pieces and pricing out dreams. In the corner, a figure in a tailored black suit observed the scene with unusual intensity, his presence notable, yet deliberately understated. While others floated between champagne flutes and social games, his focus remained fixed on the unfolding drama. The curator raised his voice, ensuring every guest could savor his witty dismantling of her work. "Perhaps, my dear, you should stick to painting houses rather than attempting to hang anything in one." More laughter, sharper now, edged with the particular cruelty of those who've never faced rejection. The man in the black suit set down his untouched champagne. As the curator reached to mockingly pat Regina's shoulder, a gravelly British voice cut through the artificial merriment. "I'll take it." The silence that followed those three words seemed to physically press against the gallery's vaulted ceiling. Every head turned toward the source of that distinctive voice, recognition dawning in waves across the crowd. Jason Statham moved through the parting audience with the same quiet intensity he brought to his films. But this wasn't a movie set. His eyes, hard as steel, never left the curator's increasingly pale face. The gallery owner, Marcus Hartley, had made his reputation destroying artists he deemed unworthy of his space. For 15 years, his word had been law in London's private art scene, his approval the difference between success and obscurity. But he had never faced someone who couldn't be intimidated by his social position or bank account. Regina's portfolio trembled in her hands as Statham approached, his presence commanding the space in a way that had nothing to do with his Hollywood status and everything to do with the controlled power radiating from his measured steps. Hartley recovered quickly, years of social manipulation taking over as he forced a practiced smile. "Mr. Statham, what an unexpected pleasure. Though I fear you might have misunderstood, this isn't actually a sales exhibition. We're reviewing portfolios for our upcoming Emerging Artists Showcase." He gestured dismissively toward Regina's work. "This particular piece, while enthusiastic, doesn't meet our standards." A few nervous titters escaped from the crowd, their earlier confidence wavering in the face of Statham's continued silence. The action star's attention shifted to the canvas they'd all been mocking moments before, a striking urban scene captured in bold strokes and raw emotion, the kind of art that came from truth rather than training. His weathered fingers traced the air inches from the surface, following the lines of a city that seemed to breathe on the canvas. "Standards," he finally said, the word falling like a hammer in the quiet room, "are often just another word for fear." Regina watched, barely breathing, as her painting reflected in the eyes of someone who understood what it meant to be judged before being seen. The curator's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the anger beneath his polished exterior. "Respectfully, Mr. Statham, art appreciation requires a certain background. While your success in action films is admirable, this is a rather different world." He gestured around the gallery, drawing strength from the familiar territory of cultural elitism. Phones had begun to emerge from designer clutches and tailored pockets, their owners sensing the potential viral moment unfolding before them. Statham's slight smile carried the weight of countless audition rooms and rejection letters from his years before fame. Different world? He turned to face the crowd, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly still space. I spent 15 years being told I didn't belong in my world, that I didn't have the right background, the right education, the right connections. His gaze returned to Regina's painting, where city lights seemed to flicker and pulse beneath bold brushstrokes. But talent doesn't ask permission to exist, it demands to be seen. The last word echoed slightly, carrying the weight of every dream that had ever been dismissed by those who claimed the right to judge. Hartley's laugh cut through the tension, sharp and dismissive. How perfectly Hollywood, turning a simple portfolio review into a dramatic monologue about perseverance. He turned to his guests, playing to his audience with practiced ease. This is exactly the sort of emotional manipulation that dilutes true art. We're not here to film an inspirational sports movie. Several guests laughed, relieved to be back on familiar ground. Regina felt her chest tighten as her dream began to slip away again, but Statham wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket, pulling out his phone. The curator's smirk faltered as the actor began scrolling through it with deliberate slowness. "Funny you should mention movies," Statham said, his voice carrying that dangerous quiet that action fans would recognize from his most intense scenes. "I just finished filming one, art heist plot. Bit cliché, I know, but the research was fascinating." He found what he was looking for, turning the screen toward Hartley. Especially the part about authentication fraud in private galleries. The color drained from the curator's face so quickly that several guests stepped forward in concern. Regina couldn't see what was on the phone, but the way Hartley's hands began to shake told its own story. "Perhaps," Statham continued, every word measured and precise, "we should discuss what real fraud looks like in the art world." The gallery erupted in whispers as Hartley's carefully constructed world began to crack. Phones captured every moment of his unraveling composure, every twitch of his manicured hands as he tried to regain control. "This is absurd," he managed, but his voice had lost its authoritative edge. "You can't possibly—" Statham slipped his phone back into his jacket with the same casual confidence he showed in disarming opponents on screen. "3 paintings sold last month, all authenticated by you personally." His eyes locked onto Hartley's. "All forgeries." The whispers turned to gasps. Regina watched as several guests quickly pulled out their phones, no doubt checking their own collections. The curator took an unsteady step backward, bumping into a pedestal that held a small bronze sculpture. It wobbled dangerously before a quick-moving server caught it. "Your reputation for spotting real talent," Statham continued, turning back to Regina's painting, "suddenly makes more sense. Hard to appreciate genuine art when you're so busy selling fake versions of established names." A woman in the crowd made a strangled sound, her face buried in her phone as she presumably discovered something about her own purchased pieces. "But this?" Statham gestured to Regina's work. "This is what real art looks like. Raw, honest, something you clearly wouldn't recognize anymore." Hartley's desperation turned to rage as his empire crumbled in real time. "You have no proof," he snarled, abandoning all pretense of sophistication. "This is slander." But the damage was spreading through the room like wildfire, carried in urgent texts and hasty phone calls. A distinguished older woman was openly crying as she spoke rapidly into her phone in Italian, presumably to whoever had helped her spend millions on her now questionable collection. The curator spun toward Regina, his face contorted with fury. "This is your fault. You and your amateur garbage brought this chaos into my gallery." He lunged forward, reaching for her canvas with clawing fingers. "I'll show you what happens to real art." Before Regina could move to protect her work, Statham was there, his hand catching Hartley's wrist with the same precise control he showed in his fight scenes. But this wasn't choreographed action. This was pure instinct born from years of real martial arts training. "Wrong move, mate," he said quietly, applying just enough pressure to make the curator gasp. The remaining guests backed away, creating a circle of space around the tableau. The action star turned art defender, the fraud caught in his own web, and the young artist whose honesty had sparked it all. Phones recorded every second, every angle, as the night's sophisticated art preview transformed into something raw and real that no one would ever forget. Security guards finally emerged from their posts, drawn by the commotion, but they hesitated at the scene before them. Their employer was still held firmly by Jason Statham, who showed no sign of strain or concern. The gallery had descended into barely controlled chaos as collectors frantically photographed their certificates of authenticity and made urgent calls to their art insurers. Through it all, Regina's painting seemed to pulse with an energy that drew every eye, its honest intensity now a stark contrast to the fraudulent facade crumbling around it. "Let him go, Mr. Statham," Regina said quietly, finding her voice at last. The strength in her tone surprised even her. "He's not worth your time." The actor glanced at her, a glimmer of respect crossing his features. With careful precision, he released Hartley's wrist. The curator immediately clutched it to his chest, playing up the victim role. "You'll all be hearing from my lawyers," he threatened, but his voice cracked on the last word. Statham's low chuckle carried across the now silent gallery. "Mate, I don't think your lawyers are the ones you need to worry about right now." He nodded toward the gallery entrance, where two serious-looking individuals in suits were showing badges to the security staff. The Art Crimes Division of the FBI takes authentication fraud rather seriously. As the FBI agents approached, Hartley's composure completely shattered. "You don't understand," he pleaded, looking wildly around at his former admirers. "The market demands names, provenance. Without the right connections, real talent means nothing." His words echoed through the space, a desperate confession that hundreds of phones captured in perfect clarity. Statham moved to stand beside Regina's painting, his presence now protective rather than threatening. "See, that's where you're wrong," he said, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "Real talent survives. It fights. It breaks through." He turned to Regina, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Your work doesn't just show skill, it shows courage, the courage to paint your truth instead of someone else's fantasy." The young artist's hand trembled as she reached out to touch her canvas, feeling the texture of her dream beneath her fingers. Around them the crowd had shifted, phones still recording, but now capturing something more profound than just a scandal. They were witnessing a moment of genuine transformation, where the artificial walls between high art and raw creativity crumbled as surely as Hartley's reputation. The FBI agents reached the curator, whose face had taken on the waxy pallor of someone seeing their whole world dissolve. "Marcus Hartley," one agent began, "we need you to come with us to discuss several specific pieces sold through this gallery." As the agents led Hartley away, the gallery's atmosphere transformed. Guests who had been laughing at Regina's work just hours before now studied it with new eyes, seeing past their prejudices to the raw talent beneath. Several prominent collectors had already pulled out their business cards, trying to catch her attention. But Regina's focus remained on her painting and the unlikely champion beside it. "Why?" she asked Statham softly. "Why risk getting involved?" The action star's expression softened as he looked at the urban landscape she'd created. 20 years ago, I was a street vendor in London. No connections, no fancy education, just determination." He gestured to her canvas, where city lights seemed to flicker with new energy. "Your art? It has that same fight in it, that same refusal to be ignored." The moment was interrupted by a commotion near the gallery's entrance. Press had already gathered outside, drawn by social media explosions about the scandal and Statham's involvement. But before anyone could react, the actor pulled out his phone again, this time opening his camera. "Right then," he said with a slight smile, "shall we show the world what real art looks like?" Regina wiped away tears as she stood next to her work, Statham's arms steady behind her shoulders as phones flashed around them. This photo wouldn't just capture a moment, it would change lives. By midnight, the story had exploded across social media. Real Art Fights and Statham Art Defender were trending globally, with millions sharing the video of his confrontation with Hartley. But it was Regina's painting that captured the world's imagination. Art critics who had never set foot in Hartley's gallery were analyzing the raw emotion in her brushstrokes, the authenticity that had threatened the curator's fraudulent empire. Major museums were already calling, not just about her current work, but requesting pieces for upcoming exhibitions focused on emerging artists. The gallery's assistant director, looking shell-shocked but determined, had already offered Regina a solo show, practically begging her to be the face of the gallery's new direction in supporting authentic talent. Through it all, Regina stood quietly beside her painting, watching as the art world's rigid barriers crumbled in real time. Statham had slipped away during the chaos, but his last words to her echoed with profound truth. Sometimes the most powerful art comes from the hands they tried hardest to hold down. The story's impact rippled through the art world like a stone thrown into still water. Within days, other galleries began announcing new programs for undiscovered artists, desperate to distance themselves from Hartley's scandal. Established collectors, chastened by the public exposure of their own biases, started engaging with street artists and self-taught creators they would have dismissed weeks earlier. Statham's Instagram post featuring Regina's painting became his most shared content ever, with celebrities and influencers rushing to champion authentic art from unexpected sources. But the most profound change came from young artists themselves. Regina's inbox flooded with messages from creators who had been told they didn't belong, each sharing their own stories of rejection and resilience. Some had given up on their dreams after facing similar dismissals. Now they were picking up their brushes again, finding courage in her vindication. The video of Statham defending her work had become more than viral content. It was becoming a rallying cry for every artist who had ever been told they weren't good enough by those who claimed to define good enough. 3 months later, Regina stood in that same gallery space, now transformed for her solo exhibition opening. Her original painting hung in the center, surrounded by new works that told stories of struggle, triumph, and raw human experience. The crowd was different too, a vibrant mix of traditional art patrons and young creators who had found inspiration in her story. As she adjusted one frame slightly, a familiar gravelly voice spoke behind her. "Knew you had it in you." Statham stood there, casual in his black jacket, looking at her newest piece. Regina smiled, remembering the night that changed everything. "I've been meaning to thank you properly," she started, but he shook his head. "Thank yourself. You did the hard part. You kept creating even when they said you couldn't." He gestured to the packed gallery, where phones were already capturing the moment. Real art finds its way through. Sometimes it just needs a little help knocking down the door. Regina looked around at her dreams made manifest, knowing that somewhere other artists were finding their own courage to break through. Sometimes authenticity was the most powerful weapon of all.